Hello, and welcome to the Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. My name is Ryan, and I am a self-proclaimed Calvin and Hobbes superfan and expert.
And my name is also Ryan, although most people call me Indy.
Okay, Indy, before we jump into the episode, we have an email. So this is from our friend Elliot, and Elliot has several things to say. So the email is titled Thoughts and Stuff, including the fiber and raisins. So,
Wow.
uh,
Okay.
yeah. And he
I like
says, hey
thoughts
guys,
and stuff as an email subject too. That's good.
yeah. And I mean, I'm pretty sure it's a reference to Pulp and Stuff, which is a nice Calvin and Hobbes deep cut.
Yeah.
So he's got a couple of interesting observations. So he says, hey guys, the Unexplained Stuff episode, that's episode 28, was fun. As the name implies, this email is some general ideas and things I've noticed after listening to new episodes and re-listening to older ones. Although, despite the serial title, serial plays no part in this email. But, so, several ideas. First, an idea about Hobbes and Mom is that when she talks to him and calls out to him in Yukon Ho, so when Mom is talking to Hobbes, this may give credibility to the possibility of her owning Hobbes before Calvin, and that while she didn't play with Hobbes the same way Calvin did, she still talked to him when she was a kid, which is
Huh.
definitely a believable theory. That's definitely something that Hobbes is an heirloom or something.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I mean, yeah, we talked about how even though the first strip seems to show him getting Hobbes, it seems pretty clear that Hobbes was there long before that. So,
Right.
even Hobbes kind of joke like, "Oh, Mom always takes your side. That's because she wanted another tiger, not you." So,
Yeah.
yeah, that would be an interesting thought if actually Mom was Hobbes' original owner.
Yeah. One other possibility that I don't disagree with that possibility, but we've also brought up, maybe he was like a baby shower gift or something, is that when
Yeah,
Calvin was a baby, maybe Mom talked to Hobbes while talking to Calvin, playing with them and stuff. So that could
yeah,
all
that's kind of my
either of
personal
those.
headcanon. That's my sort of preferred theory, I think. But
Yeah.
Elliot's suggestion is also interesting.
Yeah. And then I'm going to skip because the next one I think is the most interesting one. So I'm going to come back to that one. But he says he gives an idea of what he thinks happened during the noodle incident, that maybe Calvin got some spaghetti and mixed it with some sort of dye, red or green or something, and snuck it into the girls' bathroom and left it in a toilet and then let the mayhem start, which seems like as good an idea as any for what the noodle incident might have been.
That's true. That certainly seems like a possibility. I do
Yeah.
wonder if Calvin would be, I don't know if afraid is the right word, but to go into the girls' bathroom, like if you think there could be cooties and girls are slimy, then going into the bathroom where they hang out, I don't know. It's a dangerous prospect.
Yeah, could have been the boys' bathroom. I think it would still work. But yeah,
Yeah.
either way. And then he says we mentioned that Calvin has two essays that involve overpopulation. There's the one where Frank gets shot by Bambi, and the one where Deinonychus attacks Susie. So we said maybe that was two parts of the same essay. He says another possibility is that he did so bad on one essay that he had to write it again. So it's the same assignment, but two tries, and both times went terribly bad, which I like that reading.
I do too. That's a hilarious version of that. So yeah,
Yeah.
I like that. Nice suggestion, Elliot.
And then the last one, this one is a really good catch. So we've said before, we're not sure if Hobbes knows about Spaceman Spiff, and he thinks Hobbes might, because in one strip, so this is the one where Calvin sneaks downstairs as Spiff and shoots his dart gun at both his parents and the guests that are
Oh,
apparently at
that's
the house.
right.
Right. So do you remember what happens at the end of that strip?
Right. So Calvin gets sent back to bed and presumably gets in more trouble later on. But then we see him in bed next to Hobbes, and he's saying something like, "In the darkness of space, Spiff calculates on his one, or no, Spiff thinks about his one miscalculation. He vows to return this time with more ammo." And
Right.
then Hobbes says, "No sleep tonight, I see."
Yes, exactly. So it's not completely clear from that whether Hobbes knows about Spiff or not. He may just know that Calvin is engaged in some fantasy here and being annoying, but he might know about Spiff. At least this is the
Right.
one strip we have where Calvin is being Spiff and Hobbes is there.
Right, and comments on it too. So it
Right.
clearly hears what Calvin has said, so he knows Calvin is at least pretending to be someone named Smith at some point. So yeah, actually, Elliot, that is an excellent catch that we both missed. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
probably the strongest evidence we have that Hobbes may know about Spiff after all.
Yeah, so because there are a couple of other strips that are Swift strips that Hobbes is in, but in those, when we see Hobbes, Calvin isn't being Spiff anymore. So
Right.
this is the only one I know of where Calvin is still being Spiff and Hobbes is there. And yeah, so that's a very good catch.
Yeah, excellent.
As always, thank you, Elliot. We always appreciate the emails and the encouragement and appreciate you listening.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you very much.
Now, today we're doing something a little bit different. We'll be talking about the prehistory of Calvin and Hobbes, that is, everything from Bill Watterson's birth up to the point that Universal picked him up. But this time we joined another podcast. So we're actually going to be a guest on their podcast. You could actually find this particular episode on our feed and theirs. We joined up with Matt and McKinley Breen, the hosts of History Dispatches. So they talk about some piece of history every day. This is hitting a wide variety of topics: the Revolutionary War, Calvin and Hobbes, and everything in between. So you ought to check them out. It's a pretty fun show.
Exactly. And this episode and the episode of their podcast, I believe, will be released concurrently. So
Yes.
if you're listening to us here, you can also check out their podcast, which should also be out today.
Yeah. So go give them a look. And so we told them the history of Calvin and Hobbes. And instead of what we've done before of interviewing guests, they interviewed us. And it was a lot of fun. So we hope
It
you enjoy
was
it.
fun. Yeah. I had a great time. So thank you once again to Matt and McKinley. We really enjoyed being your guests.
Yeah, that was a great conversation. So without further ado, let's go to the episode.
Hello and welcome to History Dispatches. My name's Matt. I am here with my son McKinley,
Hello.
and we have two people here today with us. And we have Indy and Ryan from the Magic of Calvin and Hobbes podcast. This is the finest Calvin and Hobbes podcast that you'll find out there. And these guys got hold of us and said, we'd love to be on your show. And hence we have it. And I know, McKinley, you have taken care of kind of setting this whole thing up. So I'm going to pass it on to you.
Yeah, it is an irreverent and incredibly detailed look at the incredible comic strip. But I want you guys to introduce yourselves and talk about your show before we get into it.
Great. Yeah. So I'm Ryan, and I have been a Calvin and Hobbes fan my whole life. I consider myself a super fan and expert. And this year is the 40th anniversary of Calvin and Hobbes. Last November was the date. And so I got in touch with Indy, who's also a big fan, and said, hey, we should do a 40 episode podcast to celebrate 40 years. So we've just been having a blast talking about all things Calvin and Hobbes. We've got 20 some odd episodes now, and it's just been such a fun time.
Did you guys know each other before you started this, or did you just kind of know each other because you were super fans?
Yeah, we met as work colleagues. We're no longer at the same company, but that's how we met. And I actually remember when I first met Ryan, when I was interviewing, I was actually sort of surprised to meet someone who seemed to be as big a Calvin and Hobbes fan as I was, because I believe we talked about it even then. And the more I got to know him, the more I realized I'm like, oh wow, this he may even be a bigger fan and know more about the strip than I do. So that's something we've always been able to kind of connect and bond over the years. And so yeah, when he pitched this idea for a 40th anniversary podcast to me, I just thought it was great. And like he said, we've really been having a blast with it so far.
That's so cool. It's always fun when you consider yourself a huge nerd and you find someone that out nerds you about it.
Exactly.
I couldn't believe it.
It's a rare feat. Awesome. Well, you guys, why don't you take it away and tell us about the early history and the prehistory of Calvin and Hobbes?
Awesome. So Calvin and Hobbes was written by Bill Watterson. And so we'll just start with Bill Watterson's life. He was born on July 5th, 1958 in Washington, D.C. And we don't know a whole lot about his time there, other than that's where he was born. And then he lived there. And when he was very young, at some point, his family moved to Pittsburgh, where they lived until he was 6.
Right. And as fans of the strip know, Calvin is also 6. And so one thing we've talked about is how a lot of Bill Watterson's life seems to have really influenced the strip. So he and his family, which were him, his parents, and his younger brother Tom, moved to Chagrin Falls, Ohio when he was 6. And as we've talked about, we think that there's a pretty good case that Calvin also lives in Chagrin Falls.
That was one of the episodes I actually listened to. It was, you guys did an awesome job pinpointing everything from down to landmarks and such.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, the giant E on the map.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It also seems unreal that someone starts the name of their town with chagrin, because it's kind of a negative thing, to my chagrin, this happened.
Yeah, I never quite understood the name of that town, but there you have it.
I mean, it kind of makes me think of Tombstone, Arizona,
Right.
which was, I believe it was so named because, the only thing you're going to find there is your tombstone. So, yeah, some towns have very evaluative names attached to them.
Quick question. If you said we know very little about his time, is it true? Isn't Watterson extremely private?
Yes. Notoriously so, you might say. Like he got an unlisted number, moved to a different state during the strip's run, and does not do interviews.
Gotcha.
Which is one reason why he hasn't appeared on what you've correctly named as the finest Calvin and Hobbes podcast out there so far. Again,
Possibly the only one. But...
I mean, well, I'm just, it wasn't us. It was Matt and McKinley saying so, and I think they know.
Right.
Yep.
So there are lots of similarities between Watterson's childhood and Calvin's, as we've said. And one difference is that Watterson wasn't nearly so rambunctious as Calvin, but there are a lot of things that he did have in common. For instance, we know from the strip and from Watterson himself that Calvin's dad was a patent attorney specifically, not just some white-collar job. And that comes from Bill Watterson's own dad, who was also a patent attorney. In fact, a lot of the things we see in Calvin's dad come from Bill Watterson's dad. There's even a strip where his dad comes in and says, "Oh, what a day, up at 6, 10-mile run in the sleet, and now a bowl of plain oatmeal. How I love the crazy hedonism of the weekends." And Watterson's caption to that is, "This is my dad, no exaggeration."
Yeah, which I find a little hard to believe that there's no exaggeration at all, but maybe not.
That's
So,
what he says.
yeah, and later we'll talk about some other connections between Bill Watterson and Bill Watterson's father and the characters in the strip too.
You mentioned the lack of rambunctiousness in the creator's life, and I knew about that. And of course, Calvin and Hobbes are notoriously troublemakers, and I almost get this, I almost get the feeling it was a way he wished he would have had that extra step to get into those, to do those things, as we always dream. I should have taken that extra step. I should have climbed that tree. I should have went over that hill, things like that. And I almost feel like it's him projecting what he wished he would have just been a little bit more as a kid.
Yeah, a little bit, because so Watterson talks in one of his books about how he and his friend would hatch these plans. For instance, he said one time he and his friend stashed a bunch of hickory nuts in a suitcase and then stuck that in a tree, expecting to, be chased by some unknown enemy and go into the tree and get the hickory nuts and unleash a barrage on their astonished pursuers. And what ended up actually happening is the suitcase just sat in the tree for like 6 months, and they found it 6 months later with the hinges rusted and it was broken open and the nuts were all rotted. And it was just this anticlimax. And you can kind of see, Calvin's adventures actually come to fruition. And maybe you can see Bill Watterson thinking, "Oh, this is how it should have gone when I was a kid."
That's true. And he's said in some of the interviews he has done things like that he would start from the actual facts of his own experience, but then fictionalize them for Calvin's world. So I think that's right. And how much sort of wish fulfillment is involved in this could be debated, I suppose, but it's kind of like here's the inspiration from his own childhood and then, magnified to, as Ryan just said, as the fulfillment of how it could have or should have gone.
On top of that, so there's these plans that didn't come to fruition in real life. There's also things like Watterson describing that when his family moved to Chagrin Falls, they lived in this woods that was kind of like Calvin's, but Calvin's is almost like a national forest, whereas Watterson's he describes as marshy and brambly. He says you'd get stuck full of prickers or tangled in brush with your feet starting to sink into muck. So again, I can kind of see the stomping grounds that Calvin had being what Bill Watterson's ideal backyard might have been. Not that he had a bad experience, but this is what it could have been awesome if I'd had something like Calvin had.
You wanted your Winnie the Pooh woods.
Exactly.
That dream place. Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that Watterson didn't have any Calvin-esque adventures. He we learn from his parents that he likes to sled a lot. And, in Calvin and Hobbes, there's a lot of sledding down hills. I think maybe again in Bill Watterson's case, there weren't quite as many catastrophic results, but he
I hope
liked to
not.
sled. Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really interesting too, like that thing that he loved so much as a child then became such a driving force for the strip. I mean, we've talked before about how, the sledding and then sort of the counterpart in the warmer months, the wagon rides are a vehicle, no pun intended, for so much of the strip's discussion or the sort of, continuous running gags or a lot of the really deep thoughts that Calvin and Hobbes share with each other take place under that context.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of a good rundown of Bill Watterson's childhood experience. I think it's also important to point out that even as a young child, Watterson was interested in cartooning. So this was kind of a lifelong pursuit. He's talked about how he was very much influenced by the comic strip Peanuts. He said he collected books every year when they came out, and he even tried his own hand at cartooning as a young kid. If you have the complete Calvin and Hobbes, there's a childhood drawing of his. It's his own rendition of Batman that's pretty cute in my opinion. He also says that as a child, he either wanted to be a cartoonist or an astronaut, but by seventh grade, he realized he didn't understand math or science anymore. And he also says he didn't even like riding in elevators. So that kind of made the decision for him.
Yeah, that seems like that'd be a bit of a deterrent to an astronaut career. I think it's interesting too that he also talks about how, as a child, even though he loved Peanuts, a lot of the jokes went over his head at the time. And that's something that I could relate to, honestly, because I remember reading Peanuts and Calvin and Hobbes sometimes concurrently, and even for both of them having kind of the same reaction. So I think the older you get and the more you reread these cartoons, there are things you missed and really a depth that makes it more valuable as you go along. I think this also relates to some of his other influences too. So he was initially influenced by Peanuts, but then in his teenage years he found the comic Pogo by Walt Kelly. And this is apparently where the phrase, we have met the enemy and he is us, comes from, which to me is funny because I feel like I've always known that phrase, but I never knew that's where it came from.
Yeah, I guess it comes from even further back from a War of 1812 quote. We have met the enemy and they are ours. And Walt Kelly adapted that in Pogo.
That is a World War of 1812 thing from the Battle of Lake Erie. I can
Okay.
do it because we covered it on the show, and that was a note from the commanding. I think it was Perry sent it to the thing, and he says, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." Yeah, we did that on the show.
Very cool.
Nice connection, yeah.
There's a lot of influence from Pogo in Calvin and Hobbes. So Pogo has just incredibly detailed landscapes packed into a ton of panels. It's pretty wordy. The stories are very meandering, especially in the Sunday strips. And you see all that come back in Calvin and Hobbes. Bill Watterson didn't shy away from using a lot of words. The way he drew trees is just incredible. And he was so detailed with the backgrounds and the landscapes. So you can see a lot of that influence from his teenage years of loving Pogo.
You mentioned Peanuts, and I just want to say one of the things that I always thought that Peanuts and Calvin and Hobbes had, and Calvin and Hobbes, I think of these, we kind of mentioned. I think there was a new wave of comic strips in the 80s and into the 90s that I lived through. And I mentioned to you before we started, like Dilbert and Bloom County and Far Side and of course Calvin and Hobbes. But I think the one thing I enjoyed about Peanuts and that I always enjoyed about Calvin and Hobbes was it has how would I say this, a level of very sweet humanity to it.
Mm.
The Far Side is just weird and I mean incredibly funny, great stuff. But you don't learn life lessons, you don't find just gems of sweetness at times. And I think Calvin had that. You don't find that in Dilbert,
Right.
which is just like caustic and just, if you've lived through bad offices, they are wickedly funny. And I think Peanuts had that. And I think Calvin carried that over. And I think even though maybe it isn't that Peanuts-esque, I think it kind of puts in that humanity that Schultz always did with the Peanuts cartoons.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We've talked a couple of times on our podcast about how Calvin and Hobbes is funny, but it's so much more than just funny. There are strips that really get your emotions about you. There's the famous Little Raccoon story arc, and where a raccoon dies and it breaks Calvin's heart. And there's one where Hobbes is missing, a couple where Hobbes is missing, and readers wrote to Watterson worried about, is he gonna find Hobbes? And yeah, there's so much more. There's humanity. There's lessons. You're absolutely right. I agree.
And one of those, the first time Hobbes was missing when he got those letters, that was fairly early on in the strip's run too. And
Mhm.
Watterson notes that that's one way that he knew that the strip was really connecting with people. It's that, people were invested in these characters as, it wasn't just a gag a day kind of thing. It's, oh no, I'm actually worried about this fictional little boy and his lost best friend here. I think too, so we were talking about influences on him. I believe so. Ryan, you mentioned, the influence in Watterson's landscape drawing. I believe it was a landscape from another of his influences, the strip Crazy Cat, which you can actually partially see in one panel. So the family's visiting an art museum, and Calvin's mom and dad are admiring a painting, which is actually you only see a little bit of it, but it is a landscape from Crazy Cat. I believe that's right.
Yeah. Watterson specifically calls that out in the 10th anniversary book. He says if you look in this panel, you can see a little crazy cat landscape. And I think those landscapes also influence Spaceman Spiff, which, if you know Calvin and Hobbes, Spaceman Spiff is a huge part of that. And so, bringing it back to Watterson's high school years, very importantly for Calvin and Hobbes, there was a German assignment that he had that he drew a comic called, and we'll see if I can pronounce this even close to right, Raumfahrer Rolf. And it was just a silly comic about a space explorer who at the end gets eaten by a monster. But that ended up being kind of the first instance of Spaceman Spiff. Raumfahrer Rolf doesn't look anything like the actual published version of Spaceman Spiff, but it kind of started this idea of silly comics about a space explorer. So we're going to see more about the evolution of Spaceman Spiff as we keep talking. But Crazy Cat, like Indy was saying, Crazy Cat was a big influence in Calvin and Hobbes, and the landscapes of Crazy Cat, I think, show up a whole lot in Spaceman Spiff strips.
I love the absurdity that the comic strip turns into at times with things like that, where just all of a sudden a monster shows up and eats someone.
Yes.
And it's things that, wait, you don't see that in the Peanuts,
Right.
you don't see, but again, in the mind of a kid, yes, you would. And so I can imagine that's where he's drawing from again.
Yeah, I wrote a whole essay in college about how Calvin and Hobbes is great in part because who hasn't seen a 6-year-old pretending, and they obviously believe exactly that they're a dinosaur eating a caveman or whatever. It's just so genuine. It's so real 6-year-old.
And I wonder if it was just his ability to be that 6-year-old, even as he was, 36 and so forth, that it made it so good because, he just saw it through the eyes of that kid and never lost that, as most of us probably do.
I think that must be right. I mean, it's like you say, it's almost tragic. Like this is sort of related. I remember a friend of mine one time telling me about as a child trying to play with her dolls, and she said it didn't work anymore. And I could understand exactly what she meant. It's like this childhood ability for to imagine things, but just be so immersed in that it feels real, or you don't you lose you're imagining it, but you sort of move beyond that in a way. And I think that's really sad. And that is one thing that makes the strip so magical. It's as you said, Bill Watterson seemed to not lose that. He could still be that 6-year-old and impart that into the world of Calvin.
Just a couple other things relating to his cartooning aspirations. During high school, he published some cartoons in the newspaper and in the school yearbook. And again, if you have the complete Calvin and Hobbes, you can see at least one of those cartoons. It's some kids waiting for the bus, and one of them says, "It's a shame to ruin a beautiful morning by being awake." And similar ideas came up in a few Calvin and Hobbes strips when Calvin is waiting for the school bus. What am I doing here on this on this horrible morning waiting for the bus to take me somewhere I don't even want to go, or on days like this you should be able to call up a judge and promise to just read a good book all day. Things like that come back in Calvin and Hobbes. He was already thinking about these in high school.
That's right. And interestingly, though, it seems his original intention was to be a political cartoonist. So
Yeah.
there's two reasons why we might say this. So he actually submitted as a high school student political cartoons to his local paper, which got published, and he was encouraged to submit more. And then when he went to college, he was actually a political science major. So it seems his original aim, or at least thought for what his career would be as a political cartoonist.
Yeah, so he went to specifically to Kenyon College in, I believe it's Gambier, Ohio, and this college has a surprising number of successful cartoonist alumni, and by that I mean at least two.
I'm still surprised.
If I had a nickel for every cartoonist that came out of Gambier, I'd only have 2 nickels, but it's weird that I have 2.
That's exactly the quote I was going to say. Good Phineas and Ferb reference. So the other one, besides Watterson, was Jim Borgman, who is one of the two cartoonists behind the comic Zits, along with Jerry Scott, and we'll come back to him in a second. But so he preceded Watterson almost exactly. Like Borgman left just as Watterson entered college. And as Indy said, he was a political science major, but he also took one art class each semester. And while he was at college, he continued to draw comics for the student paper, the Kenyon Collegian, which was Jim Borgman's role the year before. So he was kind of following exactly in Jim Borgman's footsteps. He also got a few comics published in the local paper there called the Sun Herald. So, this whole time, that's what's on his mind.
That's right. In the Collegian, he also did a comic, and this was called Mucus and Fester. And these are a couple of college roommates who were not particularly good students. Now, this isn't exactly Calvin, so these are college students. There's a lot more drinking, partying, and colorful language, but they do sort of share the disregard for school, or at least school as it's currently taken place, just like Calvin. So you might see that in some ways as a little bit of a precursor to Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah, and so if you want to see Mucus and Fester, you can find them online. It's even more irreverent than Calvin and Hobbes, but it's worth a look. All the listeners, take a look sometime when you can.
Sounds like something college students would put together. Mucus.
Yes, yes.
Have the word mucus in there. It's going to be someone like that.
Oh, and I should say, so it's spelled Mewkis. Just if anyone wants to look it up.
But I mean, yeah, the way it sounds is probably not lost on the viewers. So
right. So okay, I mentioned Raumfahrer Rolf before, and in college he kind of came back now as the newly christened spaceman Mort. This never got published. This was kind of envisioned as an elaborate project, and Watterson never completed it because he felt it wasn't the best use of his academic time, but it kept the idea of what would become Spaceman Spiff alive. So we don't know a lot about Spaceman Mort other than that it was still kicking around in Watterson's head, and we will see more of that later.
it's also funny too. I mean, both with the name Mort and the idea that Raumfahrer Rolf immediately gets eaten. It's like this is what kept Spiff alive, though. Like these, doomed to die spacefarers of the original visions.
Right, because Mort being kind of the root word for death in
Yes.
the Romance languages. Yeah. One other thing from his college years, just a quick aside, I guess this is really post-college, but one of the few public engagements that Watterson has done was he spoke at a Kenyon College commencement in 1990. And that's an interview that is available online. So if you want to get Bill Watterson's thoughts on some pretty interesting stuff, you can look up his Kenyon College speech. So Indy mentioned that Watterson had envisioned a career in political cartooning. And after graduating from college, he did, in fact, get a job at the Cincinnati Post. Now, I mentioned that he had followed in the footsteps of Jim Borgman, who was kind of a legendary political cartoonist before he started Zits. So Borgman worked for the competing paper, the Cincinnati Enquirer, all the way from when he graduated from Kenyon up until through the first 10 years of Zits. So he was doing political cartooning for something like 30 years, 30 some odd years. And just immensely successful. Now, where Borgman found success, Watterson absolutely did not. He lasted about 6 months at the Cincinnati Post and only got a handful of comics published during that time. And you can see one of those in the Complete Calvin and Hobbes, but you can't find many because there weren't many. He really had a hard time there.
Fascinating. Again, I'm a little older than you guys, so I lived through this stuff. But the one thing is political cartoons, people can't forget, they were some of the very best and sharpest people, not just artists, but writers in the world. I mean, that was kind of like, for a lot of people, the holy grail of being a cartoonist, because you could write a good cartoon and it shows up in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times and stuff, and you're famous for it. And there were people who were known to be famous and, again, incredibly funny, incredibly sharp people. And again, with the political stuff too, I just can imagine him thinking like, that's what I want to do. I want to be one of those just really, really sharp, powerful writers, because some of the cartoonists, and even today, some of them are really good. But back, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, that was even more so.
Well, and probably even going back farther than that, right? I mean, there's the famous "Don't Tread on Me" with the snake in the 13 parts, right? So I mean, and that's something that all of us recognize now.
Out of curiosity, what year did Watterson graduate college?
Would have been the late 70s to early 80s.
Okay.
I want to say it might have been 76. I could be wrong, though.
So we're still about a decade away from Calvin.
Yeah, it took a while to get from graduating to getting Calvin and Hobbes.
Cool.
So just a little insight into how the political cartooning went. So he was at the Cincinnati Post and he said he would draw a comic, take it to his editor, it would get rejected. And as the day went on, he would get more and more desperate and, at least in his opinion, submit worse and worse stuff. And it just turned into this vicious cycle. So his contract was for 6 months, and they opted not to continue his contract, to put it mildly, I think.
They went in another direction.
They didn't pick up his option. He's part of a permanent outplacement. Take your pick, I got more.
Yeah, which I wonder too if that informs some of his approach to Calvin and Hobbes later, because I mean, then he got to a place where it was just his vision. It's a one-man operation, and he expresses the ideas he wanted, and that's where he thrived. Whereas before, as Ryan was just alluding, it's really the editors, if not ideas, then sort of approval of ideas. So, I can imagine Watterson having what he thinks is, an insightful or underappreciated take on something, but the editor thinking this isn't going to be palatable or accessible to a larger audience and saying, do it again. And I can understand how frustrating that must have been.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a little back and forth with editors in cartooning, but you have a lot more freedom. You don't have to worry about the current political landscape. And as we've talked about on our show, Bill Watterson said he loves writing for Calvin because you only have to know as much as a lazy 6-year-old.
That's true. I will say if you write for Doonesbury, then you probably do have to know about the political landscape, and you probably have to have a high level of knowledge. But setting that aside, yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, Doonesbury is a little bit of a rarity in comic strips, I think.
Yeah, in fact, I remember to bring in another one, Foxtrot. I think Jason does something where he sort of spoofs a lot of comic strips at the time, and he says something, well, here's Doonesbury, and here's a link to Encyclopedia Britannica so you can understand what they're talking about.
Right.
Nice.
Yes. So, McKinley, did you just mention what happened between graduation and us getting Calvin and Hobbes?
I was just curious the time span that we're looking at.
Yeah, so
what year versus when it started?
Somewhere between 5 and 10 years. And I think it'd be good to talk a little bit about what happened during that time, because it was bad enough that Watterson had to move in with his parents. So, not making any money. For about 4 years, apparently, he worked designing ad layouts for this weekly shopper, newsprint, like the inserts that you get or used to get in your newspaper saying what the deals are this week, that sort of thing. Not exactly glamorous. He said that it was very poor pay, and he did it in a windowless basement. And to quote him directly, he says, "One might charitably say the boss had rage issues, so the office environment was dreary and oppressive, except when enlivened with episodes of fire-breathing insanity."
I like that that's the charitable description, right? So That makes me wonder what the less charitable or just more straight up description is.
Yeah. I mean, I know it got so bad that he said for relief during lunch breaks, he would go to a cemetery to read books. So that was his escape.
It sounds like stuff from Dilbert.
Yes, exactly.
Brutality of corporate culture, you know?
Yep. And so to make ends meet on the side, he would draw editorial cartoons. He said it was mostly about the weather, which he would publish in the local paper for 25 bucks a piece, which even then wouldn't have been enough to sustain yourself, hence living with his parents. So it was rough for a little while.
And so during all this, he was now submitting comic ideas to syndicates. So somewhere in this point, he did decide that maybe a comic strip cartoonist was what he wanted to do after all. And the first submission was actually Spaceman Spiff. Now, he didn't look much like Calvin. He does describe them both as diminutive loudmouths, so I guess he does in that sense, but otherwise they're visually different. So he's an adult, he has a cigar, and he had what Watterson described as a dim-witted assistant named Fargle. And according to Watterson, for obvious reasons, the syndicates rejected it.
Quick question. Can you, just in case someone doesn't realize it, explain what the syndicate is?
Yeah, so a syndicate is just a company that distributes things, in this case, comic strips. So if you want to be a cartoonist, one approach is you can just draw a comic and submit it to your local paper and or papers in the surrounding area and see if they'll pick it up. But if you want to make money, you need to send it to a syndicate who will do the work of taking it to newspapers nationally for you so that you can get in hundreds, thousands of papers and actually make some money off of this.
That was the gold standard.
Right. So they're kind of like agents in a way. Like you might be able to get published without them, but more realistically, you really need to be part of one to have any chance of being picked up.
Which turned out to cause some problems for Watterson. Ultimately, he ended up with a good relationship with his syndicate at the end, but sometimes they kind of butted heads, and the contract that he initially signed was pretty one-sided. So we'll talk about licensing maybe a little bit later, but just as a quick teaser, Watterson didn't want to license Calvin and Hobbes, meaning sell Calvin and Hobbes merchandise. And the syndicate wanted to, and the contract was one-sided enough that they could have said, "Nah, we're selling it whether you want to or not." They didn't, but they could have, and it was a big source of contention.
Right. And so, in addition to the attempts at Spaceman Spiff, there were some other cartoons that he tried to submit before he settled on Calvin and Hobbes. And he notes that while these were also rejected and that was painful at the time, in retrospect, he was grateful because they had legitimate problems. And if he had been given a contract for them, it would have been difficult to make them work.
And I personally am also grateful that these comics didn't work out because I love Calvin and Hobbes. It's too bad that he had to go through so much difficulty on the way there, but I'm sure glad we got Calvin and Hobbes out of the deal.
That's right. It's hard to imagine one of the other attempts being better.
Yeah. So, just to give you an idea of what some of the other attempts were, there was one called Critters, spelled Critturs. And this was basically about some woodland creatures. We don't know a lot about it, but I think there's an example of it in the complete Calvin and Hobbes, and it's just got a raccoon and some other animals like playing cards in the woods or something. I think maybe kind of trying to channel Pogo there a little bit, but that one didn't fly. But ultimately, what we got to was a really important precursor called In the Doghouse. So in this one, the main character was a 20-something-year-old named Sam, and he had a little brother named Marvin who had a mop of hair that fell over his eyes, but otherwise he looked just like Calvin, and he even had a stuffed tiger named Hobbes, who was real to him, but not to anyone else. You can actually see a couple of those either online. You can look up Bill Watterson In the Doghouse, or you can also see in the complete Calvin and Hobbes. And just as an interesting aside, in one of those strips, Marvin gives Sam a gift for his writing. I guess Sam is a writer. He gives him a writer's block that he can put on his desk so that he won't have to write. And that joke was later reworked for Calvin and Hobbes all the way at the end in March of 1995, which I find kind of interesting.
It also makes me wonder if Watterson was experiencing writer's block at that point, and like that was his way of dealing with it. It's like, well, I've got a joke about writer's block that I could do, so here we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, on that point, so obviously you can tell this boy has a stuffed tiger named Hobbs was real to him, but not anyone else. Someone at United Feature Syndicate said to Bill Watterson, Marvin's actually the most interesting character in this strip. You ought to develop your strip based around him instead of Sam. So he took their advice. And at this point, he gave them what was called Marvin and Hobbes. Now, Marvin still had this mop of hair, so you couldn't see his eyes or his expression so well. And his parents seem to have been much older than Calvin's parents end up being.
Yeah, I think maybe that's because Sam is 20 something, so it makes sense for the parents to be older, but they kind of just look like 20-year older versions of Calvin's parents. Now, United Features ended up giving Watterson a development contract, including an advance payment of, I think, around $1,000. And this was more money than Watterson had seen in a long time, so he was pretty excited about it. So he drew up some more stuff for this comic idea in collaboration with the editors at United, and they even eventually offered him a full contract to actually publish this strip with one major condition, which was that he needed to incorporate an already existing character called Robot Man. Now, if you know anything about Bill Watterson, you know that he hates that sort of thing. He feels like that infringes on his artistic integrity. He doesn't want to use someone else's character. It's not his vision. And so famously, he turned it down, just like how he refused to license Calvin and Hobbes later. Here, even though he had his dream job sitting right in front of him because they required Robot Man to be part of it, he turned it down.
I'd like to say that I would have that same integrity, but I don't know.
I know.
That would be really hard to say no.
It would, right? Especially right when your dream seems to be finally coming to fruition after all that struggle. And Matt, you mentioned Dilbert before. This sounds like something exactly out of that comic strip, right? It's like everything seems to be going fine, and then some management weirdo is like, "Oh, but it'd be great. What if there was this robot in it too? Why don't you put that in your idea?" It's like, "What? No, we already had the idea fleshed out. It was good the way it is." So
Not just a robot, but a robot someone else developed.
Yeah.
You can't even like be original with it. You've got to use a robot that exists.
exactly. So, yeah, like you said, McKinley, I hope I too would have had the integrity to turn this down. And to his credit, Bill Watterson did.
Yeah, and it meant that he had to give back the advance payment that they gave him. So just add insult to injury or injury to insult or whatever. And Robot Man actually did get picked up by a guy named Jim Medic, and it was decently successful, but nothing like Calvin and Hobbes.
No.
Nothing's like Calvin and Hobbes, though. Pretty much.
No.
I have no idea. I don't know anything about comic strips, and I've heard of Calvin and Hobbes.
Right.
Like, Lord knows I've never heard of Robot Man.
Yeah, the only reason I've heard of Robot Man is because I've read this story about Calvin and Hobbes and Bill Watterson turning it down.
Awesome.
So Watterson was almost there. He had, I think it was still called Marvin and Hobbes at the time, but he had this dream on his plate and turned it down, which gave him the ability to submit this to other syndicates. So astute listeners who know who Watterson's syndicate was might have said, wait, United, that's not his syndicate. You're correct. He ended up submitting it to another syndicate called Universal, who did pick him up. And at this point, someone pointed out that the main character's eyes should probably be visible. So instead of this mop of hair, we got Calvin's iconic spiky hair. His name was also changed to Calvin in this, partly because another strip called Marvin had recently launched in papers, so they didn't want confusion, but also partly because, are you guys familiar with the underlying reasons for the names Calvin and Hobbes?
No.
Okay, so actually, Indy, you're the philosopher. Why don't you take this one?
That's right. So Calvin is named after the theologian John Calvin.
Oh.
Yeah, he had the doctrine of predestination. So we've talked about this a little bit before on our podcast. The idea is before really the universe is created, but certainly before any person is born, God has assigned them to either be part of the elect or not. And if you are part of the elect, then you're destined to eventually go to heaven and be with God. And if you're not, then you're not. And there's nothing you can do about it. So you have a fate that existed well before your own existence, and there's nothing you can do to change that. Now, Hobbes, on the other hand, is named after the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, and he's most known for his political philosophy. And he talks about a theoretical state of nature in which everyone is at war with everyone else. Everyone's just driven by their own self-interest. And so people reluctantly agree to have a government or some ruler over them because they give up a certain measure of freedom for security from this otherwise just warlike state of nature, which he describes as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And you can see some of these themes coming into the strip too. So Calvin talks about things like fate and predestination in certain times, and his own sort of struggles with his nature to be exuberant, as he say, which other people describe as misbehaving. Can he change this or not? And then Hobbes' rather dim view of human nature, which he expresses sometimes. So anyway, it's a bit of a longer answer than maybe we were expecting, but yeah, so
That's awesome, though.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so that's the origin of the name. So this innocent-ish boy and his stuffed tiger are named after these theologian and philosophers from history with sort of, we'll say, interesting views bordering on pessimistic about the state of the world.
Out of curiosity, has that been confirmed by Watterson, or has that been people have theorized that?
Yeah, it's directly confirmed.
Okay.
I like to point out the Calvinists were very controversial in their day, and they were targets, and they targeted people who were not like them. It was pretty nasty, some of the stuff they dealt with. So I find it fascinating that he picked John Calvin as the person behind it. So
yeah, I don't know that this indicates any sort of admiration for John Calvin. We can see some negative traits in Calvin's personality, him attacking Susie and stuff like that. So
yeah, and even the idea of fate or destiny in this sense, I think the strip usually takes the view that, well, no, that's a really bad way to look at things. You really can decide who you are and at least in some way shape your destiny. So my impression at least has always been kind of like you say, it's not like, oh yeah, John Calvin, that's the way we should look at things. It was no, maybe let's take a different perspective here.
he might have just taken it because it was the exact opposite of what he believed, kind of thing, where we weren't all predestined to be all these things. And so let's tweak.
Calvin.
Let's have a little fun with John Calvin.
Calvin's the one getting taught lessons. So
exactly.
Maybe Calvin, the OG Calvin, needed to be taught a lesson or two.
Yeah, Watterson's even specifically said that much of the time he disagrees with Calvin. Calvin is almost this sounding board for what Watterson doesn't think.
I love that.
Right, and I was going to say too, the Calvin in this strip sometimes learns these lessons, but often does not. And in fact, there's even a couple explicit references to this, like there's one where I forget the setup for this, but he's talking with Hobbes and he says, like, well, I guess we can learn an important lesson from this. And Hobbes says, what's that? Calvin thinks is, well, all right, so we didn't learn some big lesson, sue us, whatever. So that kind of thing. So yeah, they don't. And then there's another one. This one's the Snow Goons arc. He says, well, there's a moral to be taken from this, Hobbes, and that is snow goons are bad news. And he says he likes that kind of moral because it doesn't encourage behavior modification.
I sometimes had the feeling that there was a philosophy that I almost find, if you remember the movie A Christmas Story, and it's told from the 8-year-old boy's, 9-year-old boy's point of view, and he's just like, oh, of course adults are going to say that, but we know it's better not to be caught. Just that really honest kid's viewpoint towards saying,
oh, yeah.
We don't care about the moral. We will never care about the moral. We just don't want to be punished. That sort of a thing.
Yeah, and also the idea of you need that Red Ryder BB gun because you might have to save your whole family from, the bad guys that are attacking the house, right? So this is exactly the kind of thing that Calvin would do. So I mentioned the Snow Goons, there's that. Even things like he's just pretending to be seemingly Superman at this point. A gunshot comes up, he rushes over to deflect it from his dad and then zooms away. Like you never know. At a moment's notice, any 6-year-old boy may have to fight off bad guys. So I think Ralphie knew that, and Calvin knows that, just like every young child.
And I love how in the movie Ralphie, it's not just fighting off the bad guys and dreaming to be great. It's things like, oh, I want to go blind so I can make my mom and dad feel bad.
So
It's
poisoning.
like, wait, there's some twistedness, but then he's satisfied that they make mom and dad regret things. It's great.
Yeah, well, and there's a whole poem in Calvin and Hobbes called The Nauseous Nocturne where he imagines he's about to get eaten by a monster. And at one point, he's like, my mom and dad won't mind it. They may not mind at first, I know, but they will miss me later, though, and perhaps admit that they were wrong.
We are finding entire, connections between A Christmas Story and Calvin and Hobbes.
Absolutely. Yeah. One other thing to point out in this point that we've gotten to where Calvin and Hobbes has finally been picked up, we finally now have our familiar version of Spaceman Spiff. He's made it. He's got the mask and the blue suit and the spiky hair, and he actually shows up within the first couple of weeks of Calvin and Hobbes. So Watterson knew right away that Spiff should be part of the strip, and such an iconic part of the strip.
And Calvin and Hobbes started in about 30 papers, and it ended up in about 2,400 papers.
Jeez Louise.
I know, right? And it's since sold millions of copies of each collection in the book.
How long did it take for him to really ramp up in popularity?
So I don't know the exact newspaper count, but I know the second book, Something Under the Bed is Drooling, sold 1 million copies within like a couple of weeks of hitting the shelves. So it was already quite popular by about year 2.
So it took off quick.
Oh yeah, it really did.
Yeah, and I don't remember the specifics of when I first started reading it or anything like that. I mean, might not even been in my local paper at the time, but I just remember it being there kind of thing.
I was born in 1999, so.
You missed it.
Yeah, I've missed it, yeah.
I missed a lot of it, but I remember as a kid running home from school so that I could get the paper and see what was happening next. And I didn't care about most of the other comics, but Calvin and Hobbes had to have that one.
I would say, oh yeah, you had your specific things you liked. And a lot of them were always just like, oh, the family circus, that's mom and dad's, or something like that. You'd be like, that's my grandma and grandpa like that one, or kind of thing. You wanted cool ones.
Oh,
Right.
for sure. Yeah, so there was always the kind of debate then internally. It's like, do I read Calvin and Hobbes first, or do I save it for last because it's the best? And you kind of, every time you have to make this, what seemed like a fairly momentous decision when you're reading the comics.
It didn't seem like it. It was momentous.
It was, yes.
It was.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so there you have it. Now here we are 40 years later making a podcast to celebrate such an awesome comic. So, 10 years of Calvin and Hobbes running, and even 30 years after it ended, it continues to be popular. It continues to sell books. And we're just so happy to be able to do this and to share Calvin and Hobbes with anyone who listens to us.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and whether people were born in 1999 or they were there when the strip first came out, or you're hearing about it for the first time, we can all now enjoy this really iconic and amazing, what I would call a work of art in comic form.
Yeah, for sure.
I loved it. It was always one of those really good ones at the time. And today, obviously, in fact, I can't remember who said it, but someone said it was like the last great newspaper comic strip that, was out there and so
Yeah.
forth.
I mean, because within a 5 to 10 years, newspapers would start seeing a big decline.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, already in 1995, the internet's starting to come about.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of quick questions. First of all, about the podcast, The Magic of Calvin and Hobbes. You guys started this to coincide with the 40th anniversary, and you're how many episodes in around now?
As of this recording, we've released 23. I think we'll have
23.
a few more than that when this comes out.
How long do you anticipate doing this? Or do you even have an end date? You just however long you can think of things to talk about?
Right now, the plan is 40 episodes to celebrate 40 years. So episode 40 will come out on the next anniversary of Calvin and Hobbes.
Awesome.
Nice.
Awesome. And then my other question is when you took this on to do this podcast, what convinced you that you could talk about Calvin and Hobbes without actually showing the Calvin and Hobbes strips? Because again, the copyright doesn't allow you to be showing Calvin and Hobbes strips. So what made you like say, we can still do this and it would be cool?
That evocative in the things we say.
Yeah, for me, it was just, I feel like probably most of the audience that we would get for a podcast like this knows Calvin and Hobbes well enough to know what we're talking about. We may introduce a few newcomers to the strip, but a lot of this is going to be a celebration for people who already know and love Calvin and Hobbes. So, actually, just a little history of the podcast. When I first started this, I was in contact with Universal, and they were possibly going to support this, and it didn't end up working out. If that had been the case, we probably would have been able to show the strips, but it ended up not working out. And I thought, well, I still love Calvin and Hobbes. I want to talk about this anyway. So we just figured out, what the closest thing we can do is provide a blog post with each episode with a list of all the comics we've mentioned so that listeners can look it up. We list the date that it was originally published, so you can look it up on gocomics.com, which unfortunately does require a subscription, but if you have one, you can do that. Or if you have the books, we give the page numbers. So that's the closest we could come to being able to show these on a medium that does not allow us to infringe on copyright.
I will say, like I said, I've listened to a few episodes of your podcast now, and I literally have put the Calvin Hobbes like complete, like the main one that people get these days. I have it on a list of books to buy. You've made me want to read them.
Wonderful. Then our podcast is a success. Bottle caps of valor all around.
I do have a question about the creator. Is it true that he hasn't put out any new creative endeavors up until just a couple of years ago?
For the most part, yeah. So from 1995 until I want to say around 2014 or so, we didn't hear a peep from him. I mean, he put out the complete Calvin and Hobbes and did one online interview related to that, I think. But yeah, it wasn't until 2014 he did a collaboration with Stephen Pastis of Pearls Before Swine. You can find a couple of strips with a little girl named Lib. And so the joke is that she's better at drawing than Pastis is. And so then Bill Watterson drew the panels that were her work.
It's funny too because there's a strip in Pearls Before Swine where I don't think this happened in real life, but supposedly Stephen Pastis like pretends to be Bill Watterson.
Yes.
And this impresses a woman he meets at the bar, and later he's thinking that was wrong. So.
Yeah. And just as a fun aside, so Bill Watterson reached out to Pastis about this and said, I want to do this collaboration with you. And Pastis wrote back and said, I will do whatever you want, including setting my hair on fire. But yeah, so there was that. And he drew the cover art or promotional art for a documentary called Stripped that came out about the same time. But other than that, the only thing he's done was a couple years ago, he released a book called The Mysteries that is not at all related to Calvin and Hobbes.
And a very different style, too.
Yeah.
Is he just one of those guys? I think like Alan Moore is kind of like that. He's just really private. He believes in his art and he doesn't really care about the publicity.
Yes.
That sounds very accurate, yes.
Quick question. You mentioned it earlier about the lack of merchandising of Calvin and Hobbes.
Mm-hmm.
And is it true they estimate something like they've given up $500 million or something like that in potential revenues over these decades?
I would not be surprised. Yeah, so here's what I know. According to the internet, Bill Watterson has a net worth sitting somewhere around $100 million, which, that's plenty. But Jim Davis of Garfield has a net worth sitting at somewhere around $800 million. So, yeah, I think, Garfield merchandised all over the place. You can see the plushies sitting in people's mirrors. You can buy birthday cards. There's a cartoon show, several of them.
Bad movies?
Movies, yep.
Yeah, I haven't seen those movies because they looked bad.
Well, yes.
They were bad.
So I hope I don't get anyone in trouble, but there is one of the few Bill Watterson interviews out there. The interviewer said, I'd like to ask you about your colleagues. And he asked about Garfield, and Watterson said, Garfield is consistent.
Wow.
Yeah. So
there we go. A little qualified compliment there, I guess.
So any Calvin and Hobbes merch that we see today is all bootleg?
It's all bootleg. In fact, he quoted as saying at some point, it's something like, only scammers and thieves have ever profited off Calvin and Hobbes merchandise.
Yeah, he also said he grossly underestimated the appeal of Calvin peeing on things.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, because that's a thing people put on their car windows and stuff like that.
Yes, and just so everyone knows, that is absolutely not approved by Bill Watterson. So, and he doesn't get any money when you buy one of those.
Gotcha.
That's nuts. That's just nuts. I do have one last question. I think that last one I want to ask. And am I correct? I seem like I read this at some point. Watterson did every single pixel of all his work. He drew everything. He wrote everything. I mean, he wrote the text. Is that correct? That
Yes.
he never had anyone help him?
Yeah,
on
that's
everything?
correct.
No ghostwriters, nothing. Yep, all him.
That's just insane. That, well, I guess he's insane. You're making tens of millions of dollars and you just give it up. When you stop and you don't merchandise, and that you don't keep tapping the golden goose over and over and over when you could, but that you want that, maintain that control during the creative process is pretty amazing.
And I think that has a whole lot to do with why Calvin and Hobbes is so good, because he wasn't catering to anyone but what he wanted to do.
Right. I think it's also attached to his views on artistic integrity, which, as we talked about, is why he didn't want to merchandise it. So he feels like, even if he were sort of approving what someone else drew or wrote, that's not the same as him doing it himself. So it's not an authentic instance of the vision of the strip or what he wants the characters to be. So I think it all kind of comes back to the same sort of value that he was living by.
I also think there's like a nuance in a lot of the stuff that he does. As you talk about, oh, you can see a frame from one of the other comics that he strips that informed him, and you see it in there. But that would never happen if someone else was drawing behind it. And the very specific way he draws certain things, someone might not pick up on that, and they would just, oh, here's the tree. But you know what? He, I'm sure, would look at it and go, the tree has to be this way because of this and this and this. He doesn't have to explain that to us, but in his head, it's going to be exactly what he wants. So that's outstanding.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, gentlemen, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for telling us the history behind Watterson and his incredible creation.
Pleasure to be here. This was so much fun.
Yeah, thank you very much.
As someone once said to me when I was doing an interview with them, at the end, they said, well, if I wasn't telling you this stories, I'd be telling someone else. And I have a feeling that's exactly what you guys do when you get the chance. You just evangelize the whole Calvin and Hobbes thing.
Anyone who stands still next to me long enough is going to hear about Calvin and Hobbes.
Oh, you stopped. That means you want to hear something. Yeah.
Exactly.
So do you have a tidbit of the day for us then?
Yeah, so we've got a couple.
Sure.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so on the note of licensing, so Bill Watterson famously didn't license Calvin and Hobbes, except a lot of people don't know this. There are, besides the books, 2 pieces of legal Calvin and Hobbes merchandise. There were 2 16-month wall calendars, which I find strange. I don't know why it was 16 months, but from 1987 to 89 or something, and then 89 into 90, something like that. There were 2 wall calendars that you could buy. Each month just had a Sunday strip in it and original cover art for that calendar from Bill Watterson. They're real hard to find now because they're out of print.
I can follow up that with, they do 16-month calendars because they put them out months before the year begins. And so people can then start using them.
Ah, okay.
So that's one of the reasons that they do that sort of thing.
Got it.
We're both learning trivia.
Yeah.
One more fun fact. We mentioned earlier how there are parallels between Calvin's life and Bill Watterson's life. So we mentioned Calvin's dad was a patent attorney, just like Bill Watterson's dad was a patent attorney. There's some other parallels too. For instance, Calvin's parents apparently knew each other and were dating in high school. And the same was actually true of Watterson himself. So his future wife, Melissa, he met when they were in high school. So I think that's an interesting fun fact about the world of the strip connecting to the world of real life and about Watterson himself.
Definitely. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. Where can the internet find you guys?
So you can find us anywhere you get your podcasts, and it's called The Magic of Calvin and Hobbes. So, we have a YouTube channel, and then we're on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Spotify, all the different things. And we have a Facebook page also called The Magic of Calvin and Hobbes. So you can find us there.
And we put a bunch of links to those things into our show notes so people can just search through those and they can find you in whatever form they want to.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And everyone, thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it. If you want to check out more of our show, as in History Dispatches, we can go to historydispatches.com. And as always, have a wonderful day.
Thanks, guys.
So thank you again, Matt and McKinley. That was so much fun. We loved being on your show. Loved getting to talk the history of Calvin and Hobbes. I could do that forever. And listeners, we hope you learned something fun about the history of Calvin and Hobbes. We hope you enjoyed it. And we hope you'll join us again for future episodes.
And as always, this podcast is completely free and completely ad-free. So come along with us to learn about the history of Calvin and Hobbes and many other aspects of this amazing comic strip that we've all enjoyed for so many years.
Yeah, and let's all go together. Let's go exploring. You've been listening to The Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. We'll be releasing 40 episodes all throughout the year, from November 18th, 2025 to November 18th, 2026, to celebrate the 40th anniversary. Our intro and outro music is Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, referenced in the Calvin and Hobbes strip published on October 8, 1986. This rendition was performed by the Skidmore College Orchestra and made available under a Creative Commons license on museopen.com. We hope you'll join us next episode for more fun.